Are you ready for this? These are bellows, and historically they've been used to pump air, and they can do a great job of it, as you can see by this crazy plant. And I've been wondering lately, is it possible to use these to cool a computer instead of using fans? And what are the performance advantages of doing so? Now, obviously using this particular design would be a bad idea because of the noise that it generates in the form of the bag crunkling and also the air exiting the end here. But maybe we can redesign it, but with some sort of modern method to operate silently. Now, this is going to be an incredibly experimental journey, but we might have a breakthrough. So let's see where this goes. This video is sponsored by Squarespace. So the idea I have in mind is a system based around a rigid mover that goes back and forth within a chamber, with large valves to let air in and out. This should, in theory, allow a lot of high pressure air movement while being very quiet, but only if the method of moving the mover back and forth doesn't introduce noise. For example, using a motor and pulley system would be out of the question, as it would be simply too noisy, and really this is where the core challenge of this project lies. How on earth to move the mover back and forth quietly? Well, I have a plan, and that's to use electromagnetic coils and permanent magnets to make what's known as a linear motor, which has no quickly rotating parts, so should operate silently. Now, the first job for this is to actually make a rail containing these magnets, which are of the neodymium variety as they are very strong, and they're just the right size to fit inside a length of acrylic tubing. As you can see here, the poles are orientated so that each magnet repels its neighbours, which is why they appear to be floating. To keep the distances consistent, however, I've made some 3D printed washers to go in between them, which keeps them spaced perfectly apart when they're all squeezed together by two end caps. With the rail completed, it's now time to make the stator, which will hopefully move itself along this rail by utilising electromagnets. For these, I've again used the 3D printer to make a small winding bobbin, allowing me to very quickly make some rough electromagnetic coils using some enamelled copper wire. When this coil is driven by a low-frequency alternating current from an audio amplifier, it moves back and forth between each set of adjacent magnets, thanks to their opposing polarities, a bit like how a speaker works. When I let go, however, it just wildly flails around with no consistency, and we need to do something about this. As I'm basically making a 3-phase motor laid down flat, I've made 2 more coils and I'm going to drive them all with a 3-phase tone generator that generates 3 sine waves that are slightly out of phase with each other. And again, this signal is going to be amplified by audio amplifiers. Now, amazingly, this does actually work, which is very exciting. But despite experimenting with various coil spacing distances and different frequencies from the 3-phase generator, the motion is somewhat juddery, slow and very weak, only just able to lift its own weight. It also consumes a lot of power even for this level of movement, and to be honest, I just lack the knowledge and experience required to even get a rough prototype like this working properly. So at this point I've decided to drop it and find an alternative method. I'd love to revisit it in the future, however, so if any of you have any knowledge on how to get it working, I'd love to hear your ideas. So with my original plan for movement now basically invalidated, it's back to the drawing board. But not for long, as I'm inspired by how well the magnets fit inside the acrylic tube, with a gap around them of only 0.05 of a millimetre. That's a super precise fit, and it's given me an idea. To test this idea out, I've ordered some computer water cooling components so that I can plumb into the acrylic tube and add inline 2 pumps and a reservoir. With it filled up with water, you can see that I've left a magnet inside the tube, and it fits loosely enough for gravity to cause it to slide down on its own, but tight enough for very little water to squeeze around it whilst it does this. When one of the pumps is powered up, the magnet of course gets pulled along by the water quickly and with considerable force. To get it to go in the other direction, I unfortunately can't reverse the polarity of the power given to the pump to reverse the flow, as they only work in one direction. So instead, the other pump, which is facing the opposite way to the first, gets powered up, reversing the flow of water and taking the magnet with it. This looks very promising, as in theory I should be able to use this magnet's motion to move the bellows system along, but the pumps annoyingly do have a 4-second startup delay before they begin pumping, which means that each change in direction would take far too long, so I need to work out another solution. Now I could use 4 solenoid valves to change the direction of flow, even from a single continually operating pump, but they operate with a very loud click, so aren't going to be suitable due to this noise, as it would be hard to reduce. Now, at this point, I think that this project might be going slightly off the rails, as my next idea is actually going to be attempting to build my own silent version of these solenoid valves. For this, I'm going to start by drilling a few holes in a shorter length of acrylic tube, and then sliding on some plastic washers so that I can make another set of electromagnets around the tube. This can then have one of the magnets inserted, and to prevent it from escaping, it can be locked inside by some silicone that acts as a very soft and quiet buffer. When power is applied to the coils, one will repel the magnet while the other will attract it, causing the magnet inside to move back and forth when the polarity of the power is flipped, blocking either set of holes but never both at the same time. This can now be mounted inside a cheap reservoir, and that's basically my silent DIY valve completed. The way this works is that the water is forced into the outer reservoir chamber by the pump, and then it can enter through whichever holes are open at any moment, meaning that the flow can either go one way or the other. To work properly in a loop, I've made 2 of them, and they're all connected together with some T-splitters. And lo and behold, with one single water pump operating continually in one direction, the flow affecting the magnet section of the loop can be reversed with the flick of a switch. Nice. So with my method for movement finally sorted, it needs to be tested to see whether it's strong enough to move the bellows back and forth. So it's time to build an enclosure for it all. I'm going all in on this, so for the frame I've designed 4 panels on the computer and then cut them out of MDF sheets using a CNC router for precision. These have all the required holes and slots in them, which is quite a time saver. The large slots here are for the air to pass in and out of the unit through, and I'm going to soften their edges with some 3D printed curves and half dowel, which should reduce the chances of any turbulence noise. Now after a quick paint, first with MDF primer followed by matte grey, I can now add some real ash hardwood edging so that they look rather neat. With the frame now screwed together, it's time to add one of the side panels, which is actually a toughened sheet of glass. I've chosen glass here so that we'll be able to see the bellows system in action, as it's getting pretty unique at this point and is probably worth showing off a little. So with it screwed together and with one of the glass panels in place, it's now time to make the mover that will push the air in and out. Now as the mover needs to be thin and light, I'm using 2 sheets of acrylic for it, which have again had various holes and cutouts made in them using the CNC router. As you can see, these sheets are super bendy, but that's okay because the intention here is to use hexagonal PCB spacers to mount them together, resulting in a rigid but lightweight platform that looks visually very interesting. At the top and bottom you can see that I've added bearing mounts, which will allow the mover to slide along a set of rods for support, with each bearing having a little rubber grommet added to soften its contact as it rolls along. The rods that these sit on are actually solid glass ones, as they are rigid and extremely smooth, which should go a long way to reducing any noise generated by the rolling bearings. So thanks to the bearings, the mover can slide very smoothly and quietly back and forth, and it's very well balanced. Very cool. So, obviously I can move it manually back and forth, but I need it to move on its own. And this is where the magnet in the tube comes into play. As I insert the tube into the mover, you'll notice that it's got a ring of magnets in the centre. As the magnet in the tube approaches this ring, it is repelled by the ring of magnets, as the one in the tube is in the same orientation. Despite this, once it's actually forced within the ring's magnetic field, it suddenly snaps into place and becomes locked within this ring, despite not physically making contact with anything. With some plastic holders in place to keep the tube central, you can see that moving the ring takes the locked magnet with it, and the hope for this is for it to work in reverse when the magnet is pushed and pulled by the water. Speaking of which, after mounting my homemade valves, it's time to fill it up for a test run. Ready? Come on, please work. Not a good start. Oh, it's going. Come on. Okay, so it stopped at the other side. It moved. That's good. But I need to tweak the position of these switches perhaps. Which, by the way, are reed switches, which are magnetic switches that get triggered by a tiny magnet built into the top of the mover. And when they are triggered, they flip a relay, causing the mover to go in the opposite direction. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. I guess it's working, it's a bit clunky. One of the problems I'm facing here is that the movement is weak and slow, and it turns out that this is down to a slight inefficiency in my valve system, due to a small amount of water being able to get around the magnets. I did foresee this as a potential problem, but I had guessed wrongly that it wouldn't cause much of an issue. This inefficiency also means that it can't overcome the airlock system that I had devised, which had a goal to work in tandem with an external system to cause a constant flow of air rather than one that pushes and pulls. They're just too stiff to operate, and this had an additional side effect of causing a hooting noise as the air squeezes past the 2mm gap that's around the acrylic mover. The thumping caused by the DIY valves isn't great either. I think that that's not a success, to be honest. It's either back to the drawing board or I give up. What do you think? Well, turns out all I need is a break, as with the mental block gone now of trying to get these water valves working, I've landed on a pretty obvious solution, as the project is going to be rescued by these tiny, dumb DC water pumps that I've discovered and should have really looked into much earlier. Now, I call these dumb because they have very few electronics inside, so start up instantly, which is a big contrast to the larger pumps I was using earlier. Using just one of these tiny pumps though isn't going to provide enough pressure to move both the mover and magnet along, but that's okay as I can simply add more of them in series for a really high head pressure. Just look at this. As you can see, they not only instantly start and stop, but they do so with a significant amount of force. Here I have 5 of them facing one way and 5 of them facing the other, so the flow direction is controlled depending on which set of them is powered up at any given moment. To make them into a single solid unit, I've set them into some epoxy resin. This might seem like a very odd thing to do from a maintenance standpoint, but it will eliminate the chances of leakage due to the many connections in here, and it also increases their weight so that I can rest them on some sponge inside a sealed box to significantly reduce the noise that they generate. Another little change I wanted to make was remove this central piece that keeps the magnet centered, as it was basically rubbing along the tube, and that's a friction point which isn't great, and the idea was to replace them with bearings, a bit like what runs along these glass rods at the top and bottom. But upon removing this, I've actually found that it's not necessary at all, because the tube is now under tension and no longer bends, which means that basically it doesn't touch the mover at all. It is literally the magnetic field that is causing it to keep with that magnet that's in the tube, which is perfect and just what I wanted, and super exciting to see it actually working properly. So another thing I've done is add a bit of fabric down the side of the mover, which bridges the gap between the mover and the glass panels. And this should hopefully increase the pressure that this thing can operate at, but also reduce chances of that hooting problem I was encountering earlier. So this is all very exciting, and I think it's about time I give it a test. Are you ready for this? Yes! Yes! Look at that! Look at that! Oh! Look at that! That is so cool! Finally! It's finally working! Wow! Look how smooth that is! Wow! I know I seem like I'm overreacting, but this has been a long process to get to this. Oh, feel the air movement! Oh, it's so quiet! I'm so happy with that. On close inspection, there's actually quite a lot of cool stuff going on here, which is worth looking at in more detail. Firstly, the most striking thing is how quickly the mover changes in direction, going back and forth without clunking or directional noises. If we take a look at it in slow motion, we can see that one of the reasons for this is because the change in direction is very smooth, slowing down before standing still and then reversing gradually the other way. The primary reason for this is that the outer ring on the mover is of course magnetically coupled to the magnet in the tube, which gives the whole thing a cushioning effect a bit like that of a shock absorber. In addition, two magnets have been placed adjacent to the tube's ends so that they actually oppose the mover when it approaches, which helps to slow it down and bounce it back the other way, which is the reason why it regains its speed so quickly, as the inertia is transferred quite effectively. The air at the top of the fill pipes also has a slight buffering effect, which appears to help avoid cavitation in the pumps, as water is of course incompressible. So all in, I'm very happy, and I think it's a success at this point simply because of its sheer novelty, regardless even of how the practical performance turns out. So with the system operational now, it's time to see whether this can have any real-world use in replacing fans, and basically see how much air it can move, and at what pressure, and at what sound levels. But before I do that, I want to talk about this video's sponsor, Squarespace. From making your own online store to building a personal portfolio, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence or business. Their slick browser-based interface makes it easy for anybody to quickly build a website without any prior knowledge, and their many templates give you a helping hand keeping up with modern design trends. When viewed on a mobile device, your website will even seamlessly switch to a unique mobile experience that matches its overall style. So whatever you build will look great on every device every time. So if you find yourself with a spare moment, now is the perfect time to make that website you've always dreamed of. And to get 10% off your first order on a website or domain, head to squarespace.com/DIY perks. And do keep in mind that if you get stuck at any moment, their excellent guides and 24/7 customer support means that you'll never have a frustrating moment trying to work out how to do something. So again, that's squarespace.com/DIY perks for 10% off your first order on a website or domain. So the first test I want to run is see how much air this can move without restriction compared to fans. And to do this, I'm going to be using bags. I don't have any proper equipment for it, so this is all I can do really. So I don't have any air valves on this, so the mover is going to push the air into the bag and then instantly pull it back out again, but that's okay. It should just give us a general idea of how long it takes to fill up this bag, and then I'll compare it to the fans. So let's see how this goes. And now the same thing with a bank of fans. Surprisingly, these look more or less the same, but this is of course unrestricted airflow, So the real test will be when it's being pushed through some sort of resistance, for which I'm going to use dust filter fabric. And once it's stuck inside a box, it should simulate the airflow restriction of something like a long water cooling radiator or heatsink fins. It's a little bit crude, but it should work well for testing purposes. Now this fabric is actually quite resistive, so it's really the worst case scenario that this would ever encounter. So it's going to be interesting to see how well it handles it. So let's give it a go. Even this compared to the fans though results in almost identical performance, and this does seem to indicate that it doesn't have any performance advantage over 4 140mm fans at full speed. But what if we focus on noise and test the sound levels? Here I've got a powerful microphone off camera, and at full speed it's definitely audible but has a very interesting sound to it that might be repetitive and peaceful enough to actually send you to sleep. Take a listen. Personally, I find this less obnoxious than the fans at the equivalent air movement speed. That said, these can have the speed ramped down for less noise at the expense of airflow. But the bellows too can be undervolted to run more smoothly and even more quietly. So which sound you prefer out of these will vary from person to person, so I'll say it's a tie here again. Now I have to admit I am slightly disappointed by those performance results, as it's essentially equivalent to 4 fans, except for it's like 20 times the size. So I guess that's the reason why fans are a thing and bellows aren't. But hey, it had to be built to satisfy my curiosity, so I'm glad that I did. Now I still want to build this into a computer because of its sheer novelty. It'll be huge, like this is big already, and then with a computer on top it's going to be massive. But I just think it'd be so unique. It would be the world's only bellows cooled PC, so that would be a cool thing to have around. Now, unfortunately, I can't fit that process into this video as it is getting quite long, but make sure you press the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you get notified when that video does get released. But other than that, I'm Matt, you've been watching DIY Perks, and I hope I see you next time. Goodbye for now.